Salam, greetings. I'm Dr. Asma Sadiq. On behalf of the 𝐘𝐨𝐤 Council of North America, I'm very delighted to be having with us Dr. Afra Jalabi. And this is part of the Murataba series of the Irfan and Ihsan channel of the 𝐘𝐨𝐤 Council. What I want to say a little bit about our wonderful Afra. I'm happy to be here in her home. And just to give you a flavor, Afra, Dr. Afra, I should say, right?
Afra is good.
Afra is good. A Montreal-based writer, activist, whose interest revolves around language, hermeneutics, and nonviolence. And you've been working with the George Mason University, developed a curriculum in peace building and conflict resolution for Syrian activists, refugees, and students in Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon. She has been writing hundreds, should I say, maybe thousands. You've written articles for the Arab press for the last 17 years on cultural, religious, and political issues. And you're also a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Law and Religion at the Hamline University, right, in St. Paul in Minnesota. So you speak several languages, German, right?
My German is very weak now, but yeah.
Born in Damascus, lived in Germany, Saudi Arabia, and now Montreal.
Montreal is the longest.
It's home, right?
Yeah, it's home.
So you're basically, using all your skills, your heart, your mind, to combine ways to reduce conflict in this world. And you believe in the power of language, writing, and art, of course. So Afra, I'm going to start with asking you a little bit more about what do you mean by hermeneutics, language, and these power relations. Could you please explain that?
Yes,
to our wonderful audience?
Thank you, Asmi, for this beautiful introduction. So I want to start by saying a joke, because sometimes when people hear the word hermeneutics, they don't understand what it means, even if they're native speakers of English. So I've seen last year a very funny meme where somebody is saying, Hermeneutics, I never heard of him. Who is he?
Okay.
And hermeneutics is actually, it's based on a Greek word, Hermes, the messenger who brought the messages from the gods to humans, interpreted the messages for them. So over the centuries throughout European history, the word became to refer to the art and science of interpretation. But originally it had a very narrow definition. It referred to textual interpretation, especially of sacred and ancient texts.
Right.
But then in the 20th century, what really got me interested in hermeneutics was the German school approach to hermeneutics, where it was started by Martin Heidegger, his work, and his interest in ontology, and then he focused on language, the role of language in human existence, and he called it the house. And he called it the house of being. His student Hans Georg Gadamer then developed the theme and pushed it further, and he got interested in dialogue as a modality, as an alternative modality to domination, and the power of conversation and how language unfolds through dialogue and conversation. But the fascinating aspect, or which really drew me into his work, is that he created what is known as the ontological shift of hermeneutics. And to put it in simple terms, what he basically meant is that our interpretations are not simply psychological or subjective acts or feelings. Rather, they have their own ontological, their own being and their existence. So when we have a new understanding, a new interpretation, it's like a new creation that has entered into being, because a new understanding has consequences. Therefore, it's an event. Understanding is an event. Interpretation is an event. As a Muslim, this fascinated me because the Quran focuses so much on the power of understanding and interpretation as a means of transforming reality. In fact, the word hermeneutics in Arabic is ta'wil, and it has the connotations of being connected to consequences. Ma'ulat, ta'wil, ma'al in Arabic means consequences and the aftermath, events that happen after something. And so the word ta'wil in Arabic is connected actually to an ontological dimension. And also, as we were recently discussing in Surah Yusuf, for example, the very power that Yusuf has, the Quran shows us that it comes from his power to interpret dreams and also events around him. And Ibn Arabi takes a special interest in this, that Yusuf represents the prophet who's able to actually provide ta'wil, like of the symbolic order of being to understand. And Ibn Arabi says then the prophet takes it deeper. So where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ understood all of being as an order of symbols that we could interpret. So, and Yusuf says particularly a verse where he says, رَبِّ آتَيْتَنِي الْمُلْكَ وَعَلَّمْتَنِي مِنْ تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ. He says, you have given me power and authority because you have given me the art of hermeneutics, pretty much.
Of interpretation, of understanding.
Yeah, and therefore we see that the ability, that power and the ability to impact or transform is very much connected to our ability to interpret things. And think of Yusuf and his stories. He was victimized by so many events, yet he always interpreted these events very differently, not just the dreams, but also his life events in ways where he wasn't the victim. And that's where I see the power of hermeneutics as being where instead of like we use the power of confrontation, we use the power of encounter, of understanding things differently. And when we understand things differently, we experience reality differently.
This is very interesting. But Afra, bringing words and conversation, and we're talking about Islam, meaning peace. A lot of people talk about Islam not just as a noun, but as a verb. It's peace in action. And yet we see I don't want to just say the Muslim world, but within Muslims, there's so much conflict.
Yeah.
And it's whether it's interpretation and the dialogues are broken or they're very conflicted dialogues. And here we talk about within the Muslims and others, and we have this verse of La ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion. And yet we see so much compulsion, oppression, one being right, one being wrong. How can you use this in hermeneutics and language? How do you use it? Or how would you interpret it, should I say?
A very, very interesting question. Thank you. Powerful question. And it's also a complex question. But to go back to the term no compulsion, I would interpret it slightly differently. I normally say no coercion. Because in Arabic, la ikraha fi din, it actually, ikrah in Arabic, coercion, is derived from the root verb to hate something. So basically, when you coerce someone or compel someone to do something they hate, that's coercion. So it's very much connected to the verb hateful. And so in the Quran, when the Quran we read, there's no coercion in religion. It means anything that has coercion is not related to religion. It's a very strong statement. It's a kind of categorical imperative. It has so many connotations that you cannot enforce religion, but also that it has a larger and more profound meaning, that anything that uses the power of coercion has nothing to do with religion.
So religion is a spiritual journey within of understanding.
It's not only that, because the Quran creates this kind of archetypal image of the Prophet as the one who uses the power of moral persuasion rather than the power of coercion to transform self and other. And so again, we go back to the power of dialogue, of language. Language, the word with capital W, is very much celebrated in all our Abrahamic traditions, including also other religious traditions. And so, even in at the beginning of John, we read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word becomes flesh and walks among us. And in the first word that was revealed to the Prophet, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. And then the generosity of God is actually connected and interlaid with the power to read, to interpret, to understand, with the power of language, again, to the power of our ability to read. And so the very underlying philosophical premise of Islam, even the word Islam, is the idea of coming like to a state of surrender, but actively. Because again, some people translate Islam as submission. And I have even written a little bit about that in both Arabic and English. Because submission in Arabic is istislam. It's a conjugation of the verb in a way where the agency belongs to an external force. Istislam means somebody who has come to a state of submission because they have been forced to become pacified. Whereas Islam goes, for those who speak Arabic, it's similar to ish'al, to ignite something, iqfal, to close something. It has the agency of the doer belongs to the doer, and it comes from the verb, like from the word peace. So it is an active state of coming into peacefulness willingly, Islam, and you become also an agent of. So you're getting into that state actively, but you're also an agent of peace. Whereas istislam, submission, is something that has been forced upon you. And the reason this is
that coercion then? So
then that's coercion. Because it has been, it wasn't your choice. You have been forced to. And that's why in the Quran, the term munafiqeen, the hypocrites, is a very strong category in the Quran. Because in a society where people are under pressure or out of fear, they are hypocrites. It's considered one of the serious troubling aspects of human society, because the very premise upon which the Quranic ethical foundation is placed is this idea of no coercion, of people coming to.
So
yes, go ahead.
So where is violence and non-violence? How would this be used in conflict resolution in the world in our times? Bringing it from the theoretical to the pragmatic.
Exactly.
Where does this play a big role now?
Because this is a strong, philosophical, ethical foundation of transforming self and society. Then when we look at Islamic history, also like the founding years of the Prophet, we in Muslim society don't understand the power of the first 13 years of Islam, during which 2/3 of the Quran were revealed, where the Prophet was radically not just non-violent, but was pacifist, and he was forbidding his followers from raising their hands or even defending themselves, to the extent that one of the young Sahabis, Abdurrahman bin Auf, he came to the Prophet and he said, we were dignified people before we came to you, before we joined you. كنا أعزة فصرنا أذلة يا رسول الله. He said, we were dignified and now we're humiliated. And we all know the stories of the Prophet passing by the family of Yasser and the Ethiopian slaves, and they were being tortured, and he would tell them, صبرا آل ياسر فإن موعدكم الجنة. Be patient, the family of Yasser, for your promise is paradise. And from our perspective, when we look at that, any Muslim would have apprehension. Why is the Prophet not defending? The usual explanation in today's kind of modern explanation of that is that the Prophet was weak and they didn't have enough numbers and therefore they didn't fight, which is actually the very logic sometimes used to justify the use of violence. We were weak, we were little in number, we had to rely on violence. It's not just turn the other cheek. It's not coming from that same... It is, I would say it is, because all the Quran really creates a certain pattern of prophetic behavior in which, when they don't have the legitimate means of being community leaders or a state, they actually rely on moral persuasion. They don't resort to violence to change society. The Prophet, the way the Prophet acquired the state of Medina, the Prophet didn't go as an invader into Medina. Medina was a kind of a natural result. He was invited, and there was Bay'at al-Aqaba al-Ula, Bay'at al-Aqaba al-Thaniya. There was the first treaty of Aqaba, second treaty of Aqaba, and then there was also the Kitab al-Madina, Medina, the constitution of Medina, until he accepted to be the leader of that community.
He was also persecuted. He had to do the whole hijrat from Makkah.
They were persecuted, they were tortured, and he sent some of the early converts who were under severe persecution into Abyssinia to escape the torture, and there was a long 3-year boycott, and throughout which they ended up being starved, and Quraysh had cut off relations with them. They had to undergo boycott, social isolation, torture, and some of them were killed. And during that time, no one on the side of Quraysh was killed by Muslims. And so it was a time of extreme self-discipline and patience, and it wasn't out of cowardice or out of fear because they were small in number. It was out of a moral principle, I would like to argue, that they did not have the status or the conditions that we understand when we go deeper into the Quran, when you can use very restricted form of violence in particular situations, because throughout the Quran, the underlying message is actually non-violence. I know this will be surprising to non-Muslims and Muslims alike.
Right, because in Medina, when there's a state,
there was a state.
That's when the right to defend yourself.
That's in Surah Al-Hajj, the first verse of where people were allowed to defend themselves was revealed. When Quraysh had taken a lot of their money and that trade, we will not get into the details, when they're allowed to go into the Battle of Badr. But when we look at that history unfolding, that what the Prophet was doing is he was not creating a state from which to attack other tribes to spread Islam. What he was doing is actually he worked very systematically through a lot of peace treaties and negotiations, a lot of peaceful negotiations, including some form of limited warfare, to establish rule of law in Arabia that was chaotic and was tribal and was based on vengeance and was based on sudden attacks to steal cattle and money. And so over the years he created a political alliance and allowed people who didn't also convert to live peacefully under this kind of political system. And so we have to understand the political dimension of these wars rather than seeing them as religious wars to convert others.
So violence is or punishment or fighting back, protection.
Violence is used to actually safeguard the safe spaces of polis that were being created, because even the Prophet renamed Yathrib, the city of Medina, Al-Medina, which literally means the city or the polis. And this meant that, and people were allowed of different faiths to live in this city. And the Kitab al-Medina, the Constitution of Medina, actually predicated that people have equal rights and duties as long as they protected each other and participated in the duties of this polis. And so that is not a coercive religious atmosphere. What happened, later sometimes these events were misinterpreted, or we developed some hermeneutics of violence that do not see these restrictions and rules on how a political entity was established during that time. So it has, from my perspective, the way I see it, that these events have to be also understood politically, and we have to see the larger project of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this period.
No, I'm just thinking of, the verse that also came in the Quran, that after 4 months you can kill them.
One of the most severe verses is misquoted out of context generally by Orientalists or people who misunderstand the Quran, and it's taken out of context that you may kill them wherever you find them. This actually occurs in Surah At-Tawbah, which is I sometimes call it the Surah of transitional politics, because this surah was revealed after the Muslims captured Mecca. And they were again trying to create this kind of rule of law over very large areas of Arabia, and they were given, and the verse says, فَسِيحُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ أَرْبَعَةَ أَشْهُرٍ, be in the land, move in the land for 4 months, and then they're asked in the passage to surrender their arms and to accept to submit to the political alliance, not to change necessarily their faith, because during that time, historically, we know many Christians joined, they did not convert, many people were part of the alliance, but they're asked to surrender their arms after 4 months. So sometimes I actually say that even the Americans didn't do that when they went into Iraq. When they asked the Iraqi army to surrender, they weren't giving them 4 months to...
But then kill them wherever you find them.
Yeah, it's after 4 months, if they don't submit and they are still rebellious, armed, like factions that are causing trouble in an area where rule of law has established itself, then the Quran says these are enemies and kill them. And it's not about faith, it's about a certain establishing a political order. Some people may think this is very rough, but even modern states that consider themselves based on human rights don't give people the chance of 4 months to actually come into a political alliance.
Very interesting, the Bhagavad Gita. Maybe I'm taking it off to the Arjuna and Krishna story of also where he's going into battle and doesn't want to kill his, I'm digressing it, but I'm just bringing it back to hermeneutics. It's similar as a story. And presently, what we are seeing now, it's a very complex thing in Syria, in what's happening in parts of the Muslim world, where there's so much violence between different fractions, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, whether it's Sunni, Shia, whether it's, different fractions are killing each other, and all in the name of being right, but all in claiming religious, righteousness, that they are the right ones, and using religion. How do you work with building this nonviolence? How would you approach?
The Quran actually has very interesting categories. It doesn't use only like the good people or the bad people. It uses concepts like ad-dallin. Even in Fatiha we read the misguided ones, that some people might have good intentions, but they may cause a lot of damage or a lot of corruption. And so the Quran uses that there are oppressors and there are oppressed, but it uses the category of the prophets as the ones who kind of are able to see through the two dark sides, because generally the Quran presents the oppressed are those who are misguided, who are vulnerable, who are willing to take the side of the oppressors once they are on top of the game. And the Quran talks about the cyclical exchange of oppression. Even there's a beautiful passage where in the Quran where Moses, his followers are complaining to him, and they say, when the Pharaoh threatens, لَأُصَلِّبَنَّكُمْ فِي جُذُوعِ النَّخْلِ وَلَأُقَطِّعَنَّ أَيْدِيَكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ مِنْ خِلَافٍ, when he says, I shall crucify you, I shall cut off your hands and feet, and enslave your women and kill your children. And then Moses tells his people, اصبروا وتوكلوا على الله, have patience, have sabr, and have tawakkul. And his people are very upset. They say, لَقَدْ أُوذِينَا مِنْ قَبْلِ أَن تَأْتِينَا وَمِنْ بَعْدِ أَن جِئْتَنَا. They say, Moses, we have been hurt before you came and after you came, because they see him as a savior. And he's telling them, be patient, like the prophet telling the family of Yasir. And then the answer that Moses gives to his people in the Quranic passage is very interesting. He says, عَسَى رَبُّكُمْ أَن يُهْلِكَ عَدُوَّكُمْ وَيَسْتَخْلِفَكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَيَنْظُرْ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ. May the Lord destroy your enemies and put you as heirs, or as the victors, the inheritors, and the heirs of those in power. Put you in their place and see what you shall do. And so the challenge is that this game in which you are caught, that now you're the oppressed ones and you're complaining, but even if God destroys your enemy tomorrow and you sit in their place, what are you going to do?
Will you be the oppressor?
So the prophetic example in the Quran is seen as the remedy to this duality, as a way out for both sides, for oppressor and oppressed, because it's a disease, it's a malaise in humanity, which is why it's mentioned in the very first revelation to the Prophet, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَيَطْغَى. A human being has a propensity to dominate, or to become tyrannical. And so the Quran presents tyranny as something that we need to overcome, and that it has both sides, both the oppressor and oppressed, and that our role is to heal this malaise, this sickness for both sides. Because if we're going to have victory over our oppressors and take their place and and repeat the same atrocities.
Caught in the same cycle.
We're caught in the same.
So
world.
the new
We're in
horizons, the new horizons of dialogue and hermeneutics that we talk about language, and we're creating a new opening, it's a new conversation, it's a new event.
It's the Quran is a linguistic event. The prophets come, the Quran present them as those who possess the power of the word with capital W. So they are the ones who create a new hermeneutic horizons for their society. And then this society is able to see itself completely in a new light.
So for now, as in your peace building, now I'm going to bring you up to my last question because I'm going to keep your attention with the work that you've been doing to use language and hermeneutics to heal and do this power dynamic that we are seeing to bring some conflict resolution. How are you working, or how have you found it to be effective?
So you see, when you talked about the Muslim world and all the complexity in which we find ourselves, in a lot of my trainings, I like to orient the students or the trainees to the nature of our age. So I use a lot of ideas of my uncle, the Syrian scholar 𝐥𝐢𝧗 and also Hannah Arendt, who actually talked about the nature of our nuclear age. And my uncle really very much was interested in the way war has become obsolete in our age, because now nuclear weapons mean there are no victors.
Annihilation.
It's complete annihilation for all of us. So we have to rethink the whole category of war. And those of us who are engaged in these armed struggles and small wars and sectarian wars, or even the liberation wars, are playing in a world that's actually by character nuclear. And therefore the superpowers like really are managing certain crises and mitigating or maintaining certain conflicts in ways that serve their interest. And the small people are not benefiting. They cannot make detrimental decisions with armed struggle anymore. We live in we need to understand the nature of our age and the character and nature of our weapons. And I was really touched deeply when I found out recently, only a few months ago, about the great scholar Ahmadou Bamba Mbaki, a Senegalese scholar who was the founder of the Mouridi movement, who died at the beginning of the century in the 20s. I think he died in 1926 after resisting the French. He was radically nonviolent pacifist, but he resisted the French through economic boycott and economic prosperity for his Senegalese and Mauritanian communities where he worked, because he sometimes got exiled. But in some of his writings, he talked about how we have come upon the end of armed jihad, because the nature, and this was before even the invention of the nuclear bomb, but when he saw the amount of killing and destruction, modern technology and modern warfare created, he felt this is completely un-Islamic, and that we are entering an age where we really need to change the terms of engagement. And it's as if he had this premonition of the nuclear age, and he used education and economic prosperity for his community, and economic boycott with the French, and he drove the French crazy because he was so powerful. And Touba, the second largest city in Senegal, was actually created by him because a lot of the refugees and runaways would come to him, and slowly it created a community, and now it's one of the largest cities. We know, and we know very little about what Abdul Ghaffar al-Khan did we don't know our history, even contemporary history, let alone have like an understanding of the classical period.
Yeah, no, Afra, this was wonderful, and this is a long conversation. There are going to be many questions. I'm sure we'll also get some from people, and this is the beginning of a series. It's a very big topic. I tried to cover a lot, and thank you, Afra.
Thank you for having this dialogue and conversation.
We're trying to change the horizon.
We need to take the prophets as a model of how they transformed self and society through the power of love and the power of language. and the connection to God. And these are linguistic events rather than physical events. And that pushes our hermeneutic horizons to a new level.
Absolutely. When you get a new insight, it changes a feeling, you changes yourself, and nothing can change on the outside unless we change ourselves, right? Isn't
and the
that
Quran
another
says,
Quranic?
in Surah Fussilat, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. God does not change the condition of a people until they change that which is in themselves.
Wow. Thank you so much.